Most? Got it now. Awesome. Thanks. We had a couple technical issues tonight, so apologize for starting a few minutes late. But I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's presentation. And if you would, a reminder to silence your cell phones, if you would please. And once we have that complete, if you would please rise, take off your caps, and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. It's great to see such a great crowd tonight. Thanks again for coming out. I know we have at least one World War II veteran. Anybody else in the house? A round of applause for our one World War II veteran in the room. Thank you for being here tonight, sir. I also want to give a shout out to our other veterans who have served and anybody who has previously served in the armed forces. So thank you for your service. I also want to thank all of our folks that are tuning in from online, increasing our range and our scope, and obviously something that we did during COVID, but we're able to continue doing that and continue our outreach. So thank you for tuning in to those online. I want to remind you that we're a charity organization, and so we rely upon donations. And so two ways you can do that is donate your time and your money. One way you can donate your money, or two ways actually, is one through the helmet committee. So you'll see some helmets on the way out. Thank you, sir, for your time. And you can throw some money in there. They accept all sorts, all denominations from any country in the world, I believe. Checks, credit cards. And also you saw the book sales going out front as well. So if you didn't already, take some time, take a look at those books. They're relatively inexpensive, as you'll find out, and mostly World War II topics, some military history topics. And again, all those funds go to promoting this organization. So thank you for your contributions. I have two public service announcements tonight. The first is I want to give a shout out to the World War II American Experience Museum. And they just opened their doors last month. They're just outside of Gettysburg. I don't know, has anybody been there before? Been there? A few people have seen it already. So there's some flyers on the outside table, on the welcome table. But there's two events coming up this weekend that I just want to call out and let you know about. On March 4th at 5 o'clock, there's an evening with Susan Eisenhower. She's going to provide a talk and a book signing. So there's a way to information if you're interested in signing up for that. And that's going to be at their museum outside of Gettysburg right there. And then also on March 18th, they're having a St. Patrick's Day 1940s style big band dinner and concert. So again, just more information on that. You can find it online as well, but there's some flyers outside. So two big events that they have coming up this month, and they're going to help promote our program as well. And at this time, I have a special announcement. Oh, Laura, you can come up. And my second announcement is last month, my father was here, Colonel Don Patton, talking about the World War II Roundtable in Minnesota, who our speaker's already been to and spoken at that roundtable before. But he was promoting his the World War II Roundtable history tour to London or to England this summer, 2-week trip, 8th Air Force primarily. And so if anybody's interested, I know some people were last time and maybe signed up already, but if you're interested in more information about that tour, come find me afterwards. I got some information I can share with you. And now I'd like to introduce Laura for a special presentation.
Thanks, Jeff. Not really a presentation, and believe it or not, I'm nervous. I'm actually the person behind the emails because standing in front of people with a microphone is not my specialty. But we can't let this go without acknowledgement. On March 3rd, 2003, this organization had its very first meeting, 20 years. How many of you have been coming for 20 years? A couple of hands. Hold your applause. Hold your applause. How many have been coming 15 years? A couple more. How many 10 years? And how many 5 years? So still growing, still reaching people. All of this is only possible because of my friend Bill Jackson. And this was the first president, and due to Bill's commitment to keeping the history and the legacy of World War II veterans alive, this organization was born and has grown tremendously, and we owe Bill a huge round of applause.
Thank you. Little piece of history. My late friend Jack Thomas and I are military history buffs across the board. And in 1998, we founded the Hershey Civil War Roundtable. And it grew and was successful. But Jack and I were always a little uneasy because our main interest was World War II. So as Laura said, in March of 2003, we talked the Hershey Library into letting us meet there. And I convinced a member of my father's World War II unit, the 104th Infantry Division Timberwolves, who was a professor over at a college on the West Shore, to come and be our first speaker. Well, we didn't have too much of a crowd, but when we got our second speaker, things picked up real fast because he was a guy by the name of Dick Winters. I don't know if that name rings a bell to anybody, but Major Dick Winters, resident of Hershey, and good friend of mine for over 25 years. Crazy story, I was covering an event. I used to own the Sun weekly paper here in town. I was covering an event back in the early 70s, and a man came up and tapped me on the shoulder. He says, "You're Bill Jackson." I said, "Yes." He said, "You edit the Sun?" I said, "Yes." He says, "My name's Dick Winters. I just moved into Hershey from Fredericksburg from my farm, and I'm interested in what goes on. And you know where all the bodies are buried." And he said, "You and I have to start having breakfast together." Well, that was the beginning of a 25-year friendship, 25 plus. But anyway, I've been delighted to see our World War II roundtable go from strength to strength. And look forward to our speaker, Dr. Myers, tonight. I had to quiz her. She has a master's degree from Texas Tech, and I have a connection with that university and having lived in Texas. But anyway, without further ado, thank you guys. Glad to see you here.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Laura. Well, it's hard to follow up that, but we are here for the main event. So at this time, I'll introduce our speaker for this evening in the program. So Dr. Sarah Myers is originally from Missouri, but as Bill said, she went to school in Texas, got her PhD from Texas Tech in history. She's currently the assistant professor of history at Messiah University in Mechanicsburg. We could have carpooled. Where she teaches courses in 20th century U.S. history, gender, public history, and military history. She has a manuscript that should be published later this fall, hopefully, later this year. So it's not out yet, but we'll welcome her back if she would like to advertise and have book signing. And it's entitled Earning Their Wings, The Wasps of World War II and Their Fight for Veteran Recognition. She's been on PBS shows, she's been on C-SPAN, but most importantly, she's with us here tonight. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sarah Myers.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me tonight and for all the people who are watching online. I'm really excited to talk to you tonight about the women Air Force service pilots and their service during World War II. I want to start, though, by talking about them just briefly in the context of women in the U.S. military during World War II, and also in the context of just larger, women's history for what they, meant in terms of their introduction into the military. I thought I would get started here with, okay, actually, I'm going to go back to look at my laptop so I can see the slides as you see them. Okay, so I want to get started today by looking, if you look at this picture, the woman who's second from the left and the woman sitting beside her. The one on the left is Cornelia Fort. The woman sitting beside her is Evelyn Evelyn Sharp, excuse me. And these two women are 2 of 38 who lost their lives during the war. And I thought it would be nice to start by hearing directly from Cornelia Fort, who wrote to both her parents back home and also wrote in magazines about her experiences flying, because I think that what she says captures a lot of the themes that I'm going to talk about tonight. So Cornelia Fort, in a letter home to her mom in 1942, said, "I was happiest in the sky. At dawn, when the quietness of the air was like a caress, when the noon sun beat down, and at dusk, when the sun was drenched with the fading lights." I thought this is really poetic way of describing her love of flights and being in the air. Later in the war, in 1943, she wrote this in a women's magazine and said, "As long as our planes fly overhead, the skies of America are free. And that's what all of us," sorry, I just realized I need to change the slide for you. "And that's what all of us everywhere are fighting for. And that we, in a very small way, are being allowed to help keep that sky free is the most beautiful thing I have ever known. I, for one, am profoundly grateful that my one talent, my only knowledge, flying, happens to be of use to my country when it is needed. That's all the luck I ever hope to have." Cornelia Fort was tragically killed in a mid-air collision in March 1943 when she was flying a plane across the U.S. As a part of her ferrying duty. She crashed into the plane of a male pilot. At the end, like when both planes were on the ground, he later testified and said that he was responsible for the accident, but nothing came of that in terms of disciplinary action or anything like that, because he was eventually sent overseas to combat. As one of the 38 women during World War II who died in this women's pilot service, she was not allowed to have a military funeral because the WASP were considered civilian during the war. And so what that meant was they didn't have military benefits of health insurance and things like that. And then once the war is over, they don't have benefits of the GI Bill, et cetera. For some of the women, I'll talk more about them later, some of them do end up getting military funerals because local places wanted to give them one, even though they weren't technically supposed to have one since they were civilian and don't get military status until 1977. But for most of the women, they don't even have a military escort home. Their parents or their spouse pay to ship their body home. So in the context of women in World War II, there are over 350,000 women that serve in the U.S. military. This is the first time that women are integrated on a military status into all of the branches except for the WASP. And it's also the first time that you have women entering into some of the branches specifically, but also into new roles in the military. The WASP in particular started in 1942. There were 2 famous women pilots during World War II. One was Jackie Cochran, and one was Nancy Harkness Love. They're not so much known now, but at the time in World War II, they were really famous because they were friends with Amelia Earhart, and they had flown in air shows and won races and things like this. Now their names are a little bit less recognized, but during the World War II era, they were very well known. These 2 women actually approached the Army Air Corps in 1939 when the war started in Europe, and asked if there was a need for women pilots, because they said, we are available, we know women who have a lot of flying hours and we could be useful. At that time, the Army Air Corps said, we're not interested, thanks but no thanks. And then if you fast forward to 1942, The Army Air Force, as it was then known, was commanded by General Henry Hap Arnold. And Arnold at that time was realizing that there was a valuable need for women to replace men on the home front, doing things like ferrying, like what Cornelia Fort did, and introducing them into some other roles. And so he told Nancy Harkness Love and Jackie Cochran that they could start women pilot programs. Their programs eventually merged in 1943 and were called the WASP. Nancy Harkness Love had a program that was 28 female pilots, and they were all like really highly skilled and seasoned pilots. They had like hundreds, if not thousands of hours flying. The women's pilot program that Jackie Cochran was given was actually women who had 200 hours at least flying time and who needed like military training to learn how to fly planes. And so they had like Army Air Force training the same as men. And then eventually these merged to be the WASP. So just for an idea of numbers, there were 1,102 women who served under the umbrella of the WASP during World War II. That includes 1,074 who graduated from Army Air Force training, and 28 women who were a part of Nancy Love's program that were responsible for ferrying and that did not go through Army Air Force training. Again, this is out of like 350,000 American women who were serving in the war, so this is the smallest women's unit. During World War I, there are women who serve in the Army in the Signal Corps. These women, sorry, I keep forgetting to show you guys slides, so I'm going to go back to the women's unit for a second. So the women's units, they all had acronyms except for the Women Marines. My favorite story about this is that General Thomas Holcomb of the Marines said that he looks at the Women's Army Corps that's known as the WACs and the women in the Navy who are known as the Waves, which is very intentional pun on their behalf, right? He looks, the Army Nurse Corps, Navy Nurse Corps, eventually the WASP. And so when he's asked by the media, why don't you have an acronym for the Women Marines? And he said, they're Marines, they don't need a nickname. And was very offended that, all these other branches are using cutesy and punny nicknames. And so, yeah, so these are the women's units. The Coast Guard one is not so much an acronym, but, used after the Coast Guard's motto. Okay, so going back, the very first women who are incorporated into the U.S. military on actual military status are the women who are in the Army Corps in France during World War I. These women actually don't get military status and veteran status until 1977, but they got military status and veteran status on the same bill as my women pilots, the Women Air Force Service pilots. And so I thought it was worth mentioning that these women are technically the first, because women are in, these expanded roles of all these different branches during World War II. Okay, so I want to now turn and talk about what the WASP are doing, what their training looks like, things like that. So when you think about training, they are going through the same training as men in the Army Air Force, with the exception of combat. Although there are a few women who talk about how their instructors thought it would be fun to teach them combat aerial maneuvers, and so they said that they actually had not preparation for combat, but they learned aerial combat maneuvers because their instructors just thought it would be fun to teach them. But as a whole, they were not supposed to be prepared for combat. They were just supposed to be prepared to fly in the continental United States. And so they learn things like navigation and physics and have ground school classes. And then they also have flying time on primary, advanced, basic aircraft. And then what happens with regards to their training is that they train at, a few classes train at Houston, Texas, but most train in West Texas, which is 2 hours from Texas Tech, in a place called Sweetwater, Texas. I use this picture because I feel like it captures perfectly what they experienced in West Texas and what they collectively talk about in terms of their experience, which is the wind, which you can see it like blowing them right in this picture, and also the sand, because they talk about the dust storms and the terrible dust storms that you have in West Texas. This base, Avenger Field, was turned into an all-female base, and so the WASP are the only ones that trained at this base starting in 1942. And so you have some male instructors and some female instructors, but only female trainees. So there are no male pilot trainees. And so I use this picture because there were very strict rules about where, women's interactions with their male instructors, right, and things like that. And so this sign says, like, women trainees only in this area, because women were only supposed to be in certain areas of the base and not interact with their instructors outside of class, things like that. But I also used it because the women pilots nicknamed this base Cochran's Convent, after Jackie Cochran, who was the director of their program. I think you see what they were going for, right, in terms of the strict rules that she had imposed. The other thing that's funny about it, though, is that when it is converted into an all-female training base, all of a sudden, the air traffic controllers at the base find that there are male pilots that need to make emergency landings. And there are so many emergency landings in a short period of time that Cochrane says, okay, we're done. Like, if you have emergency landings, you're gonna have to go somewhere else. And so she talks to General Arnold, and Arnold issues this, request that men emergency land somewhere else, which I just love everything about that. And so, so they dub it like Cochran's Convent while they're there and while they're training. And it is unique in that respect that they're the only ones training at this base. After they graduate training, they serve in the continental United States at over 120 Army Air Force bases during the war. They are not allowed to fly overseas. There was this proposed idea of having women ferry planes from the East Coast to Great Britain, but that is actually then turned down because General Arnold and some other Air Force officials are worried that if one of these women pilots dies over an ocean, in some tragic accident, that could be bad PR for the program and potentially lead to it being shut down. The Army Air Force is really aware of this negative media campaign that's happening against the WACs, the Women's Army Corps. There's all sorts of rumors being spread about the WACs in the media, none of which are true, some of which involve implying that the WACs are servicing men sexually overseas, or that their sexuality is changing because they're in the military, and all sorts of rumors are spreading about them. And so the Army's constantly putting out these fires in the media. And so the Army Air Force is we're a much smaller unit here, much smaller organization. We don't want this negative media campaign coming for our WASP. And so they're we have to be really intentional about the roles that we tell the media these women are doing, and also we don't want there to be any tragic accidents that might make people, afraid of what the WASP are doing, or concerns about changing gender roles, or all the things they say about the Women's Army Corps. And so the only women who fly overseas in terms of to different countries or over oceans fly some ferrying missions to Canada. And there's a few WASP who I found ferried missions to Puerto Rico and Cuba. But beyond that, they weren't allowed to do anything else. There were some women, actually, though, who joined the WASP that before they joined the WASP program, they flew in 1942 with the British Air Transport Auxiliary. The British Air Transport Auxiliary was responsible for ferrying aircraft. A lot of the ferrying was done from Great Britain over the English Channel into mainland Europe and things like that. And they actually hired women from all over the world to fly in the Air Transport Auxiliary, literally all over the world. And so there were some American women who served a stint with the Air Transport Auxiliary, came back, joined the WASP, went through military training, and then flew for the WASP. But they would be the only ones that would be considered flying overseas per se. All right, so their assignments. So primarily, this is a publicity photo of them at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. The women are primarily ferrying aircraft. So again, like this is a job that men are also holding on the home front. The women are just like replacing some of these male pilots so that others can be sent overseas. And so when they ferry planes, they're taking them from like factories to bases so that then male pilots can take them overseas, et cetera. And so ferrying is the major role that the WASP hold during the war. The majority of the WASP are involved with ferrying and things like that. And I thought I would give you 2 quotes from women who talk about how this job of ferrying, but also the job of flying military aircraft, was so much different than civilian flight, because the civilian planes that they had access to were small, lighter weight aircraft, didn't necessarily fly as fast if you think about like pursuit aircraft and things like that. And so I have 2 quotes that represent their description and discussion of how much they loved military flying, and that also represent why they wanted to fly for their country during World War II in the first place. Okay, so this is WASP Lillian Yonley, and she said, this is a picture of her as well. She said, "When you take off, it's power. You push the throttle forward and it pushes you right back into the seat, and you go on up. It's beautiful up there. It's a very special feeling." And I liked this quote in particular. Thanks for changing the slide. I like this quote in particular because it represents the power that they felt when they're flying certain aircraft, particular bombers and things like that. And it also represents something that General Arnold actually talked about in the, like towards the end of the WASP program, towards the end of the war, when he said that like, it takes so much upper body strength to fly planes that I actually wondered at the beginning of the war, you know, when I first started these programs in 1942, if women are going to be able or capable of like flying them. Because there were all these like questions about like, since it takes physical strength, will women be able to do it? The Army Air Force also is really concerned about not just their physical strength, but their emotional fortitude to fly military planes. There was this fear that women would have, you know, quote unquote emotional breakdowns and would crash government airplanes, you know, thus destroying taxpayer dollars. And so, I'm not making this up, I wish I was, the Army Air Force had doctors that literally were stationed at the different Army Air Force bases where the WASP were stationed, and also that were at Sweetwater, Texas, that required the WASP to report their menstrual cycles because the Army Air Force said we should not get women to fly during this time of month because this might be the most likely time for them to have an emotional breakdown. Yes. The WASP are like, we really like flying military planes and we're not really interested in this backstory that you've created about us. And so when this monitoring first begins and they're supposed to report it, a lot of the women tell the Army Air Force doctors like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, like I missed my period this month. Like we must have just missed it." Like, and so at one point I just loved reading these Army Air Force memos that say like, we're really like sick of this being our job. Like the doctors are like, we're really sick of this because very few women are even reporting to us, if at all, and like it's clearly not affecting their like flying time, so could we please not and just like forget this. And so I just love that the women collectively are like, resisting in this small way. This is Wasp Vi Cowden. Her first name is Violet, but she went by Vi. She says, again, this is a picture of her standing on a P-51, because I was like, I have to make this thematic, right? She said, "The P-51 was the love of my life. It was so well engineered that when you were flying and once you had it trimmed, if you leaned forward, it would go forward. If you leaned back, it would go. It would go up. You could turn it, you didn't have to touch it." And you can just hear in her, this is her years later in an oral history interview telling this to this woman who's interviewing her about her wartime experiences, how much she admired and loved this plane. And so this quote represents the fact that there are so many WASP who say that the reason why they signed up for this program and volunteered in the first place is because they just wanted to fly for their country, because they loved flying, which again is true of like male pilots as well, right? I really love the stories from male and female pilots where they talk about what inspired them to fly, because some of them talk about like Charles Lindbergh or Amelia Earhart, right? Or they say like, there was a barnstormer who landed at, on my dad's farm and I got to ride in a plane for the first time ever. Or my favorite interview that I did once with a pilot, he said that he literally just like put his hand on an airplane and just knew that that was it for him, like he needed to fly. He didn't even fly in it or like ride in it, he just touched it and that was enough. So it's just like this respect for like the technical side of things too, right? And what they see is like the beauty of airplanes and the beauty of like flight and flying, and just how much they enjoy it, right? And so they have the same motivations as men in terms of wanting to fly because of literally the profession, but also because of wanting to serve their country during a time of war for patriotism, right? And then some of the WASP also actually said they joined for similar reasons as men, where they say, like, we wanted revenge. Like, one woman's husband died overseas in Europe, and she's like, I wanted to avenge his death. And so it's, again, like, these are very similar themes to other people who were serving during World War II that aren't, like, specific to them as women. So after the WASP were successful in ferrying aircraft, the Army Air Force decides to experiment and see what else are these women capable of doing, because again, the more women we can get into roles here, the more men we can send overseas. And so one of the first things they introduced the WASP to after ferrying is towing targets, like target towing. This is represented in the top left-hand picture. So literally, again, this is male and female pilots. There's a target hooked to the back of their plane by cable. And male cadets on the ground, as you see in the right-hand picture, practice anti-aircraft artillery. And so they practice shooting at the targets. So the pilots in the air fly the same, maintain a certain altitude and fly the same pattern repeatedly. And then that's when, men practice from the ground. If you're wondering how this worked, they put colored casings on the shells, and so then they would know, like, okay, these came from blue, these came from red, and so they would know, like, performance-wise how people did. They also had male pilots, like, practice combat maneuvers, and they would do the same thing, where they would put colored casings on the bullets, so they would know, again, like, okay, blue, you did well, like, red, what was happening, like, et cetera. And so they practiced this. So one of the women that I interviewed about this said that her quote about this was that it was the only flying I did by the seat of my pants, because even though she's flying like the same pattern repeatedly, she said, you're still nervous because live ammunition's being shot at a target that's hooked to your back of your plane. It's fine. And so there are no women who die from live ammunition during the war, like from target towing, but there are some women who die towing targets. The reason is the same reason that there are male pilots who also die towing targets during World War II, and that is that you don't want to use good planes for this, right? Because there is some shrapnel that hits the planes, and so the planes have something wrong with them in the first place. So they're either returned from overseas combat and you've put together fixes to them, or they're older planes or whatever. There's always something wrong with the planes. And so there's really horrific stories about some of the women in particular who were serving at Camp Davis in North Carolina, who, something was happening mechanically with the plane. She needed to bail out and she couldn't get out because the hatch wouldn't release. And so she was trapped in the airplane when it crashed, and the people on base who were there witnessed this happening, right? And so this story is not unique to the women pilots, but what is unique about it is that when male pilots died towing targets, they had the option of a military, funeral and benefits and things for their family, whereas the WASP did not, because they were considered to be civilian. Even though the WASP are organized and as like military and have Army Air Force training, they're issued military uniforms, which I'll show you a picture of here in a second. They're even, like, despite these facts, they're still considered civilian because Congress was responsible for making decisions about who is military and who isn't. So Congress voted on the WACs, they voted on the Navy, the WAVES, they voted on the Women Marines, etc. And I'm going to talk here in a little bit about how the WASP are the last women's unit to go before Congress and like what happens with their bill. Another job that the women did that's represented by a famous male pilot who, this is probably a little bit hard to see from this picture, but is on the far left-hand side. This is Colonel Paul Tibbets, who was, I'm sure almost everyone in this room here knows, but just in case people online don't know, he's the pilot of the B-29 that dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima in August 1945. He was a very famous B-29 pilot. That's how he got that responsibility or that assignment. And so pictured next to him are Dora Doherty Struther and Dorothea Johnson Mormon. These are two of the WASP. And Paul Tibbets personally trained them in flying the B-29. The reason is because when the B-29 was first developed during World War II, it had some problems. There were some engine fires that happened, and they eventually worked this kink out, right? So no longer do B-29s have engine fires, but the original versions did. And so when this happens, there are some male test pilots who die as a result of testing the B-29. And so the plane is dubbed like a widowmaker. You see what they did there. And so the male pilots are not as eager to fly it as they are other aircraft. And so in conversations with General Hap Arnold, Paul Tibbets comes up with this idea of, why don't I train some WASP to fly the B-29, and then they can fly demonstrations for men, and then what do you think happens, right? So what they did, literally, like the women just learned how to fly the B-29, just like other women who learned how to fly other planes to ferry them across the US. This is not like new, right? And they literally just learned how to fly it and then fly into Army Air Force bases. They get out of the plane, and then as Paul Tibbets describes it, like morale like immediately improves, right, towards the B-29. And so they're like using these like ideas about women to like, and using the women like to then bring about like successes for things during the war. Okay, so like I said, they're organized as military. So they are sworn in, they have Army Air Force training minus combat, they have dog tags, they have dress uniforms. Pictured here on your right are women in the graduation ceremony at Sweetwater, Texas, where again you can see that it's like the flat desert of West Texas. But these are their dress uniforms that are in like the Army Air Force blues, and they're the dress skirt like version of their uniform. The woman pictured on the right, or I mean on the left, is a WASP that I interviewed in her home in Indiana, WASP Marty Weil, and she talked about how much she loved the like military organization of the program and how she really wanted military status because she wanted to have a military career. And so I took this picture of her and am using it in the PowerPoint because she was so proud to show me her military uniform and had pride in her military service, even though, during the war she only gets to fly for a limited time before Congress votes not to give them military status. And I just loved the like imagery of her showing me her wartime uniform. When the program's organized as military, General Henry Hap Arnold, he really wants the WASP to be like a permanent part of the Army Air Force. And so he describes the like intention of the Army Air Force to utilize women pilots in this specific way in the future. For the WASP, who are the 38 who are casualties, I wanted to show you an example of some of the ways that this is like talked about during the war. So on the top left, I'll read it for you because I realize that it might be a little bit hard to read. It's the top left-hand picture is of an in memoriam section of the WASP newsletter at Sweetwater, Texas, at Avenger Field at their training base. And essentially the WASP, just like other men's units, came up with their own newsletter to talk about what they were experiencing during training and things like that. And so Jane Champlin was one of the 11 trainees who lost her life in training during the war. And this is what they write about her. They said, "We'll miss you, Jane, but we won't forget you. The way you made us laugh, the many friends you found among all our classes, or the cause for which you made your sacrifice." And then on the right-hand side, they wrote this something similar, except for the male pilot instructor who died with her in the crash, and they told him happy landings as an in memoriam for him, which was a common phrase used in the time period. The bottom right picture is because once the women received military status in 1977, the WASP Museum in Sweetwater, Texas, at the site of the original training base, has a memorial service for the women every year. So when they were faced with this loss of military status, I want to talk about why potentially this happened and also their reactions. So WASP Lorraine Zillner Rogers said, "Oh, we were very sad because we were living in it and had been all through training and then our different assignments. It was all we talked about, thought about. Suddenly, in a few days' time, here you are, completely nothing. It's such a transition we have to go through afterwards. I mean, to this day, all I have to do is hear a plane go overhead, and I'm right with that pilot up there." And so she's reflecting on the program shutting down on December 20th, 1944, after Congress voted no to not grant the women military status. And so I wanted to walk through my arguments about why this is the only women's unit during World War II that's not getting military benefits or veteran status. All right, so the first example I have is from a 1944 political cartoon that references, it has a male civilian pilot wearing a WASP dress uniform, and there's a sign in the window that says, "For sale, WTS pilot's uniform." And the WTS stood for War Training Service. So during the Great Depression in 1939, prior to the war even starting in Europe, FDR starts this program, New Deal program, to train civilian people, men and women, to be pilots. These were civilian pilot training programs that were based on college campuses across the US, and they trained one woman for every 10 men, and the program was free for these civilians, so you could get free pilots training, which was a really big deal because it was expensive to get flying time if that's what you wanted to do, if you're interested in flying. And it's also a really big deal because even now, it's really expensive to get flying lessons unless you have a friend to teach you or an inside connection or you join the military, right? And so there's a lot of women who become the WASP because they actually got flying time and learned how to fly through the civilian pilot training program. Same thing with male pilots in the Army Air Force. The program lasts from 1939 through 1944, but they actually stopped training women December 1941 because of Pearl Harbor and the US declaring war. That's when they transitioned to only training men. But prior to that, there were a lot of women who were trained in the program. So this photo is referencing the fact that in 1944, in discussion with the Army Air Force, the FDR decides to shut down this program. So the civilian pilot training program is shut down. There is not seen as a need any longer to train male pilots. And these war training service pilots, these civilian pilots who've been training for the duration of the war, sometimes for prior to US involvement in the war, they're now eligible for the draft. And so what they argue before Congress is they say like, hey, the women are taking our jobs. Like, we want to serve in the Army Air Force on the home front. You know, we've been pilot instructors, we know how to fly, like, let us have these jobs. The Army Air Force, including General Henry Hap Arnold, Tunner of the Ferrying Division, even Secretary of War Henry Stimson, report to Congress in their testimony and say, hey, most of these men are actually not qualified for, the Army Air Force because of different things that are required in terms of eyesight, age, etc. And so they said, we don't actually want these men entering the Army Air Force, right? And so we've invested all this taxpayer money in training the WASP. Please just grant the WASP military status as we originally intended, and let's move forward. But Congress is really hung up on this, and this political cartoon's representing the imagery of it, but there's a lot of media coverage, but also a lot of testimony from these civilian pilots. And so in the congressional debates, Congress talks a lot about the fact that, do we really want women taking jobs from men, especially since this is the summer and fall of 1944. There are larger concerns from the American public about, like, what is going to happen in the future with regards to women and things like that, even in like factory jobs, trying to emphasize that, men need their jobs when they return home. So is something similar happening here with the WASP? Congress also talks about the media coverage of the program. So in their debates, when they're like deliberating, they reference this Life magazine article. Life magazine had such a wide circulation during World War II that it makes perfect sense to me that they would reference this, because the woman on the left, her name was Shirley Slade. She was one of the WASP. This is a picture of her during training at Sweetwater, Texas. They actually specifically, like the Life photographer, specifically asked her to do her hair in this specific way because he said he thought it looked more feminine, and he actually picked the WASP to be on the cover, and he says that he picked her because he thought she was the prettiest one. So this like whole staging of how she's sitting, her pigtails, like everything about her was like intentional by design for this like civilian Life photographer. The images inside the magazine, I have one example for you here on the right. Almost all the images feature the WASP at Sweetwater, not like doing things that are professional or like geared towards flying, but at leisure. So there's lots of images. This is women sunbathing, right? So Congress definitely references this picture. There's also pictures of women just like sitting, waiting on the flight line, waiting to fly, and they're drinking like a Coca-Cola, or they're writing letters to their family. And so there's not a lot of like action or discussion of what they're doing in terms of assignments on the home front, but a lot of emphasis on like, look at the women sunbathing and look at them, writing letters home, not referencing the fact that they're very limited, periods of downtime that they have. Yes, they are relaxing, but this is all like staged for a specific like purpose, right? For a like magazine article. And then the last like nail in the coffin, according to my arguments, is that there is this Hollywood movie that came out in 1944. It was called Ladies Courageous. It's one of the worst things I've ever seen, and the WASP say the same thing, because some of the WASP actually saw this in theaters during the war. And Congress, again, talks about this Hollywood movie, which I feel like is very common or relatable. Again, right? Like when something is, becomes a big name picture in the movies, everybody's talking about the latest movie. So Ladies Courageous, actually the Army Air Force let this film director borrow U.S. government planes. So they actually used Army Air Force planes in the making of the movie. It features, the title is very misleading because it makes it sound like, courageous female pilots maybe or something, right? But actually what the movie's about is about a group of women who are flying for the military. It's very vague. They don't necessarily say the Army Air Force, but because they're trying to make it vague. But they're flying during a time of war for the military, and they're more interested in flirting and like finding a husband than they are in flying. And so some of the women are like flirting and crash an airplane, right? And so they have like all these dramatic plot twists and love triangles and all sorts of things that are happening in the movie. And so when Congress talks about this in the Life magazine article, they literally say, like, I know what the Air Force officials told us the women are doing, but like, are they? Or are they just like a bunch of glamorous pilots? And they even reference the language of a lipstick squadron, which was used by a journalist during the media to try to make it seem like these are like glamorous women who are just like having a lot of fun on the home front, basically. And so because of these like deliberations, they vote not to grant the WASP military status, again, despite all the highest ranking Army Air Force officials, and despite the fact that, like, you know, Secretary of War Henry Simpson, other government officials are saying the same thing. So when the bill fails, this is another WASP quote about this, Lillian Roberts-Risden. She said, "The point was that the government owed us. They did. We worked for the government, we flew for the government, we died for the government, the same as men. Many of our people got killed. So it's no different when it's a WASP getting killed than when it's a man getting killed. They're just as dead. Their families are just as bereaved." And so a lot of the WASP talk about, like, even if they didn't care about military benefits or the GI Bill or anything like that, what they cared about was the fact that, like, the 38 WASP who died during the war didn't have, you know, recognition, basically. And so after the war, just like a lot of other veterans organizations, the WASP met for like yearly reunions. So I have like just a couple decades represented from the 1940s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. The top right, it's a little bit hard to see, but the woman in the shiny dress, that's Jackie Cochran, the former director of the program. She attended a lot of their reunions and hosted them at her ranch, actually, a couple times and things like that. And so they meet for reunions, they reminisce about the war, you know, catch up on each other's lives, just like other veterans groups do. But every now and then, they say in their like newsletter to each other, oh, you know, at our latest reunion, we talked about maybe like trying to get military status, like, because it would be really nice to have veterans benefits. And some women say, like, it'd be really nice if those 38 women could be recognized, things like that. But then, you know, it's more like just like discussion and organizing, but there's no like concentrated effort until the 1960s. So in the 1960s, the WASP enlists the help of two important men that become like essential to their campaign to get a bill before Congress to try to get military status. So I was going to tell you about these two men and kind of their role. So both men are pictured here, but I have them listed like separately just to see different offices. This is Senator Barry Goldwater, who's seated at the desk, and the man on the far right is Colonel Bruce Arnold, who I'll talk about in a second. Senator Barry Goldwater, he was really interesting to me because during the time when women are being introduced into service academies across the U.S., he was actually opposed to women's admittance into those academies, and so he had like specific limitations about the roles that he thought women should hold in the U.S. military or the education that they should receive. But he was a very strong advocate for the WASP because he served alongside them at Newcastle Army Air Force Base during World War II in Delaware. And so when he hears about the WASP wanting to get military status, he was like, oh yeah, they should definitely get military status. Like, I flew alongside them in Delaware. So this is like an obvious like choice that we should be making. Colonel Bruce Arnold, who's the one pictured on the right, and I also have a picture of him here in some DC offices of his, he lends the WASP some resources of his own, like politically and financially. Colonel Bruce Arnold is the son of General Hap Arnold, and he said, like, hey, I want to basically continue my dad's legacy. My dad wanted this to happen, so I want to make it happen. And so he supported the WASP, again, like politically and financially, in their campaign to try to get the American public and congressional support behind a bill. While they're doing this, the WASP are getting the American public to like sign petitions and things like that. My favorite example of this is when the first Star Wars movie came out in theaters. There was a WASP in LA who camped, you know how like people camp out outside movies to wait to go in, right? Like because you want to get a good seat or you want to get in or whatever. So she went to like all the people camped out around LA at all the different movie theaters and got them to sign her petition, which I just love because they're just like, you know, sitting there and she's like, hey, like do something worthwhile while you're waiting, like sign this for me. And gets them to like a bunch of people to sign it. And so they submit these petitions to Congress, and eventually there's a bill, a congressional bill that goes before the House and the Senate that passes both. President Jimmy Carter signs it into law in 1977. But along the way, like before it is passed, I wanted to give you an example of some of the things that the WASP were talking about. So they're collecting all this like data and information, which is compiled in a lot of these like DC offices, where they'll take, they send in pictures of their dog tags, their honorable discharge certificate, their like, you know, assignment orders, everything they can think of, they're sending to the DC offices. One of the WASP writes this questionnaire where she asks the women, okay, fill out this questionnaire for me that lists everywhere you were stationed during the war, like all your details about your military service. And then she asks this question, did you expect to be militarized? Like, did you expect to be like military? And so this is my favorite quote from those like questionnaires. WASP Jenny Allman Disney said, I most certainly did expect to be militarized, and I was most disappointed when we were disbanded. I did not join, train, and serve to become anything other than a pilot, and I wanted the opportunity to continue to serve in an airborne capacity. I never flew an airplane that asked if I were a Mr. or a Mrs. or a Ms. And I really liked this quote because she's not only talking about how she wanted to be military, but also how she's like, the airplane doesn't care, you know, like who's flying it, right? And there were women pilots in the 1990s and even into the early 2000s that I found that when they're doing interviews with the media and the media is making a big deal about, you know, the first women, like Thunderbird pilot, the first woman, whatever, some of those women say similar responses as this like last part here to the media where they say like, I kind of wish that we weren't making, like I know it's cool that I'm a woman and I'm the first one doing this, but I kind of wish we weren't talking about it and instead we were talking about the work that I'm doing, you know, as a part of my military service. And one of the women in particular said something very similar where she's like, no plane ever cares like who's flying it, right? And so I just really liked this like quote and discussion because it relates to women pilots like more recently. When these debates are happening in Congress, there are national organizations and regional organizations that express support for the WASP congressional bill, but there are also national organizations that express dissent or like disagreement about giving the women military status. The biggest argument is that if you grant these women military status in the 1970s, decades after the war, will this open some sort of Pandora's box to all sorts of other units and groups coming and trying to get military status? Like, what does that mean for, you know, the future of the military if you have all these different groups just constantly trying to get military status? I don't feel like we should do it, is what some groups argue. The Air Force Association supports the WASP and says, yes, we think they should be military. Local and regional chapters of the VFW and the American Legion support the WASP, but the national ones do not. So the National VFW and the National American Legion issue statements before Congress, and I wanted to give you examples from the Deputy Director of the National Headquarters of the American Legion, Robert Lynn. He literally read in testimony before Congress from the United States Code, Section 101 of Title 38, and he read this definition before Congress. He said, the term veteran means a person who served in the active military, naval, or air service and who was discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. And then he continued. He said, in the history of our nation, the veteran has, from the time of the Revolution, occupied a special place in relationship to the American people. In the main, our wars have been fought and won by the citizen soldier who, in responding to the nation's call, is fulfilling a basic obligation of citizenship. The WASP at first are kind of excited by this because they're like, we literally fit this definition of veteran because we were honorably discharged, right? And we were seen as being active military by the Army Air Force. And then they also say like, yeah, you know, like we feel like we fit this too, right? Like that we're serving our country and that this is an obligation of our citizenship. But towards the end of Robert Lynn's testimony, he goes on to say this concept of basically that if the term veteran is given to the WASP, he said that it will like forever, you know, hurt the definition of the term veteran because he says, you know, all these other groups are going to come and want to have veteran status, and then does being a veteran even really mean anything anymore, basically? And so he, as representing the American Legion, again, this is the national level. I found all sorts of local and regional chapters that supported the WASP, but at the national level, they do not. Regardless of this testimony, Congress does decide to grant them veteran status in 1977, and President Jimmy Carter signs it into law. So this means that the WASP are eligible, for example, if they want to be have a military funeral or be interned at Arlington National Cemetery, right, and things like this. So it was seen as a big deal to them. Some of the WASP said it made them emotional because, again, it was providing honor to the 38 women who died during the war, and so they thought it was special for that reason. I also included a picture of the Congressional Gold Medal, which they received from Congress in 2010, and this is a picture of that ceremony and of the Congressional Gold Medal. The thing I wanted to leave you with is that there were still debates as late as 2015 about the women's veteran status, and this comes to a head. You might have actually seen this because it made national news. From Elaine Danforth Harmon, who was a WASP living in Maryland. I actually had interviewed her a couple years before she died, and when I interviewed her, she had told me that she really was excited to be interned at Arlington National Cemetery, and that she was like proud of her like military service, and that she really wished that she could have had a military career, but you know, she's happy that she got to have the limited one that she did. And she comes from a military family, and so she said this was really important to her in terms of her like larger family history and things like that too. Then I read in the newspaper, literally, in 2015, that Elaine Harmon had passed away and her family had asked for her internment at Arlington, but she had been turned away because earlier that year, in March of 2015, the Secretary of the Army had actually issued a memo essentially stating that they were running out of room in the internment walls at Arlington, and that they were going to have to start limiting who is interned there, and so they said the WASP can no longer be interned there. So they were on a list, a list that was excluding them. And so they rejected her family's request later that year in September to be interned there because they said, you know, this memo was issued. Her granddaughter, Erin Miller, who's living in DC and was an attorney, said that she looked into what can I legally do about this? Because my grandma really wanted this and I'd really like to make it happen for her. And so she talks to, gets legal advice. And she finds that, yeah, technically you could sue and maybe they might make an exception for your case. But if there are other WASPs that die after, your grandma, Elaine Harmon, then they would also have to do the same thing, and it would be this whole deal. And so she realized, like, oh, we really need a congressional bill to make this happen so that it can be like a permanent change so that every single WASP doesn't have to try to, legally try to get permission. And so, long story short, in 2016, by a miracle, the House and the Senate unanimously passed the bill, which is why I say miracle, because the unanimous part, right? That never happens. And so they unanimously passed this bill to add the WASP back to the list that can be interned at Arlington. And in September 2016, there was the funeral service, and this is her daughter, Terry Harmon, receiving the flag at her funeral, and then Elaine is now at rest and earned in Arlington National Cemetery. And so I included this because even as late as 2015, 2016, the WASP were still having to fight for their right to this title veteran that was still being contested. So does anybody have any questions? I included a picture of one of the WASPs from Connellsville, Pennsylvania that I interviewed.
Question over here.
Yeah. You're mainly talking pilots. In the air crews on the fairing, were there men as the radio and navigator and stuff like that?
They did, yeah. So just to make sure everyone can hear, I think they can hear online if they say into the mic. I don't have to repeat it, right? Do I need to repeat questions? No?
Nope.
Okay, great.
We got you.
Okay, great. Yeah, they had, sometimes in some cases when they're ferrying planes, actually the co-pilot was a man, or vice versa, where the WASP was a co-pilot, but the bombing crew itself was often just all men.
Hello.
Mr. Jackie Cochran, and there's kind of two things that I argue with Jackie Cochran. One, she's the first woman to break the mock, and she broke it in F-104 during the Eisenhower administration. The other one was that I'm not sure she did after the war, but she was the one who designed the uniforms,
She did.
the initial uniforms for the Air Force Academy when they opened up in 1950.
So Jackie Cochran, he was referencing the fact that she's actually only the second woman in U.S. history to fly a jet. There was one WASP during World War II who got to fly a jet, and then Jackie Cochran later does. The reason why that's important or significant is because when the WASP program shuts down in December 1944, women are not admitted to fly military aircraft for any branch of the service until the early 1970s. So it's a really long time before they can, and because they don't have jet aircraft experience, with the exception of this one WASP during World War II and Jackie Cochran, who at the time would be too old, women can't be involved in space flight because you had to have jet aviation experience to get to fly in space, and so women were completely excluded from that. So yeah, thank you.
No, the fact is, she did break the mock.
Yeah, she did, yeah. Thank you. In the very back.
Yeah. In follow-up the 1977 ruling and also with the example you gave at the end, we have had a history in this nation following Revolution, Civil War, World War I, where in aspects the government reneges on the commitment made to veterans, which has evolved into demonstrations or worse. And I was just wondering, in your estimate, how have we done as a government following the 1977 commitment?
To the WASP specifically?
Yes.
Or, yeah, so, I mean, I would say that it was going okay until 2015, 2016. But there were some moments in the early 1980s where there were some women who all of a sudden decided hey, I want to tap into my benefits and go to the VA for something medically, and they were turned away because they were told what? No, you're not, because there were just misunderstandings in the updated paperwork from 1977, and so there was something that happened to a lot of WASP in the early 1980s. But beyond that, I would say that getting Congressional Gold Medal in 2010 was helpful for getting them recognition, and they've had support otherwise since then. Yeah.
So were the other women services, were they militarized afterwards, or were they considered part of the military when they joined?
They were considered military once the congressional bill passed. That's a really great question. So women entered into all of the branches of the military, but they didn't have military status until their bill would pass. So actually, women would enter, and then at a certain point the bill would pass, for the Women's Army Corps, for example, and then they would get military status, and then so on and so forth for the other women's units. And there were a lot of women actually after World War II that used the benefits of the GI Bill to get like a college education and reduced rates on loans and things like that, and took advantage of the GI Bill after the war. Most of them were told, like in all the different branches, most of them were told like our intention is to grant you military status. So if you're entering the service and you're going to go through basic training, you're going to go through the same basic training as men minus combat, because we don't have intentions to, you know, put you in combat. But you need to be prepared. So they had them take an oath of all, like when they're like, you know, after they're like entering basic training, and they're like, you need to be prepared to be converted to military. So the initial women though for each branch though weren't, but later they were once the bill. Oh yeah, so those happened in, pretty much all of them were 1943. The WASP, there was like one in early 1944, and then the WASP bill's the last one in the like summer of 1944 and fall of 1944. Yeah, so 1943 is like the big year.
Yes, I had heard a story coming out of World War II that when they introduced the B-26 Marauder,
Yeah,
which was known as the Widowmaker,
yeah.
that supposedly a lot of the male pilots were very uneasy about flying it, and supposedly Jimmy Doolittle got a couple of the WASPs to bring one in and do some aerobatics and things with it, and put those guys to shame. Is that a true story?
That is a true story. So I didn't include it for the presentation because I was like, I'll do the one famous pilot like with Paul Tibbets. But yeah, same thing with Jimmy Doolittle and the B-26. My favorite like newspaper headline from this was, it said, "Sugar and spice, wasp make nice," and which I felt like was just so like cheesy, but also fit the time period. And so they had the women do maneuvers with the B-26 to reassure male pilots like, hey, the B-26 is now okay as well, because it also in early testing had issues. There was like a kid in the back too, Chris.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for a truly incredible presentation this evening. I'm a retired judge advocate, and I spent 33 years in Germany. And one of my secondary jobs was teaching for Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I taught law classes all over Germany, England, Spain, out into the middle of the Atlantic. And about 1 out of 10 of my students were women, and I always tried to encourage them. But I don't think anything I did in 30 years would inspire them as much as what you just did tonight.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I would punt that back to the WASP to say that they're the inspirational ones. I appreciate that.
Another question in the back. Is any wasps alive?
That's a really good question. There are some that are still alive. I don't know the exact number, but it's a really small number, because right now I think the youngest, if I do the math quickly in my head, is right, like 97 is how old the youngest one would be. And so most of them are in their late 90s or early 100s.
Yes, hi. Did most of the women ever fly alone, or were they always in crews? And if so, how many in the crew?
Yeah, so good question. So in the bombers, they always had a co-pilot and a crew. In the pursuit aircraft, they typically had someone with them, depended on the plane. So, and it also depended on the pressure or rush or need to ferry a plane. And so sometimes they were by themselves. If they were in other aircraft, they were just by themselves. They also flew though, they would transport men sometimes. So they would fly cargo planes full of men that needed to be transported across the US and things like that. Yeah. They also were trained in their navigation themselves, and they also were trained in instrument flying in case you had bad weather and counted bad weather, so you could fly solely from your instrument panel. That was something that all male pilots did during World War II too, with a little link trainer device.
I want to ask you, did any of the enemy have any female pilots, Germany, Japan? Also, how about our allies, Canada and England? Were they either combat or non-combat?
Yeah, fantastic question. So Germany had female pilots. They were not in combat, but they did ferrying and test piloting. They had like hundreds of women that did that. The Soviet Union had a lot of female pilots that were in combat. They also had female who were in bombing crews who were doing things besides flying that were like snipers and tank battalions and things like that in combat. Great Britain had a large number of women ferrying planes, and they actually had a lot of women from Canada and all over the world. Like there were some women from China that went to Great Britain to fly with Air Transport Auxiliary, women from South America, from different European allied countries that went and like flew for Great Britain. There were also women, the last country is Romania, that flew, what were they called? Basically they flew people who were injured. So like the hospital planes, there was a name, but it's escaping me. And so women in Romania flew those planes.
Can you comment on how many women pilots are in the military today? And I'm going to assume the number's not that high, and would you be able to explain why that is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And your question also relates to women in commercial aviation. The reason that I don't have the current stats off the top of my head, but if you emailed me later, I can give you the exact numbers. But they have a minority of like women still, like a very small number in like all branches of the service, right, for military pilots, but also commercial aviation. Because essentially what happens is after World War II, commercial aviation really kicks off. And some of the WASP even go because they want to have flying careers, and so they go and say, hey, we have military plane like flying experience, we've got this. And commercial airlines tell them, the American public's not ready for a woman to fly a plane. You can be a flight attendant. Here's a different application. And so because of that, like women are excluded from commercial aviation for like forever, right? And then same thing with the military, because they don't admit until 1973 the Navy's the next like iteration of women as military pilots, and then everybody else does it too. And so it's like a gap from 1944 to 1973, and so that puts women at a disadvantage. And even things like representation matter too. If you don't ever hear a female pilot on your commercial flight or see them in the military being represented, you don't necessarily like think of that as a role of something you can do. So there are lots of women pilots who I've seen in the last like 10 years who try to go to air shows and things to try to increase their visibility in the hopes that like girls will dream of being pilots and know that this is like a path for them.
All right, before I hand over to Chris, has anybody been to Avenger Field in Texas, the Sweetwater? Nobody? Wow, all right. So my daughter Kate's in the front row, and we actually went there in 2019, and I'll show you a picture of it later, but I thought maybe there'd be a few people that have been there before. It's a great experience. Many of the pictures that you showed brought back memories from our trip, and I'd encourage anybody, if they have opportunity, if you're in the middle of Texas, because it is in the middle of nowhere, it's a good place to stop by and grab some food and tour the museum. I'd like to hand it over to our president, Chris, for closing thoughts and our gift.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I got to juggle a few things. Sarah, small token of our appreciation here. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it. And I think the best compliment was, let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.
I think just a few more words till we close, but thank you, Sarah, so much. And I think we had a great compliment from one of our guests as well, that you really did a lot to educate us tonight on women aviators, and we really appreciate it. They served an amazing role during the war, and women, of course, on the home front made a big impact, but also in the war service. We think about nurses a lot and during the war, but also clerical, different things women did in the military. But women's Air Force service pilots was obviously a very dangerous duty. 38 women gave their lives during World War II in that duty. 11 during training, the other ones during active missions they were on flying those aircraft that Sarah talked about. Thank you, our founder, Bill Jackson. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being our founder 20 years ago. We're on 2 decades now. Thank you so much. And our first president, obviously. Also want to thank our team of volunteers, which we have quite a few, and not all of them are on the board. We have some on the board, but some are not on the board, and some are other volunteers were never on the board, but they all serve a role. They all make a positive impact. It's a team effort. I want to emphasize it is a team effort that we put together every month for you guys to make the show go on. We will not have an April meeting because it's Holy Week here at the church, but we will be back in May, May 4th. World War II veteran Robert Thompson will be here. So he's a 2nd Infantry Division combat infantry soldier, so he has an interesting story to tell about being in Normandy, Brittany, fighting along the way, Battle of the Bulge, where he was captured by German troops, and then a POW in a Stalag there in Germany until about the end of the war. So thank you for coming to our meeting. We look forward to seeing you at the next public meeting in May, and have a good evening. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.